All right, greetings everyone. Thank you so much for your attendance and interest in diversifying housing. I'm Andrea Donlin, a land use and natural resources planner with the Franklin Regional Council of Governments. I'm joined here tonight by my colleagues, Phoebe Walker, who is FERCOG's Director of Community Services at FERC, and Jen Audley, the Community Health Improvement Plan, which is also called CHIP, project coordinator. We're so happy also to have Dana Lewinter, Lily Link, and Whitney Demetrius from Citizens Planning and Housing Association, also known as CHAPA, here tonight to present about diversifying housing opportunities in Franklin County. CHAPA is a partner in a multi-year grant that FERCOG was awarded called the Improving Housing to Improve Health, or IH2 project, with funding provided by the Massachusetts Community Health and Healthy Aging Funds. As many of you know, housing, and in particular affordable housing, is a critical need in our region and around the country. The population in our area is getting older on average. Households are getting smaller, and there haven't been that many new homes built in Franklin County in the last 10 years. As we try to diversify the types of housing needed for the current and future population of the area, there are certainly some challenges that our small towns face. Many of you are already involved in the effort to expand the housing opportunities in the region, and we look forward to the questions and discussions that will arrive during this presentation. Whitney, Lily, and Dana have worked in communities across Massachusetts to help support local housing efforts and coalition building. They have a lot of experience, and I think you'll enjoy their presentation. Just some basic meeting ground rules before we begin. Feel free to enter questions in the chat. The CHAPA and FERCOG staff will be keeping track as the presentation goes on, and the CHAPA folks, you can decide whether to pause to answer questions as they pop up or just wait till the end. If you'd rather not put a question for everybody to see, you can send the hosts, anybody from FERCOG or CHAPA, a question privately through the chat as well. If you're on the phone, I think we have one or two phone people. If you'd like to ask a question, you can raise your hand virtually by pressing *9, and you can unmute yourself by pressing *6. This workshop is being recorded. Feel free to turn your video off if you prefer, but it's also nice to see faces out there in Zoom land. We will be posting the presentation and the recording on the FERCOG website, and we'll send it out to all the participants in the next few days. Thanks again for attending, and I'll now let Dana, Lily, and Whitney take it away.
Great, thank you, Andrea. I'm gonna kick us off. Just make sure our screen is showing. So can folks see that? A thumbs up that you can see the screen? Excellent. Yep. All right. Well, we're really happy to be joining you all tonight. This is, we've been working with you all in Franklin County for about a year and a half or so, and in a lot of different ways. And this is an opportunity for us to share some information, learn a little bit from you all, and have a really good discussion. So it'll be equal parts us presenting and also having some of these discussions with you as we start to make some plans to move forward in the work that you're all doing. So we'll be talking about diversifying rural housing opportunities. You saw in the chat where we were asking you to all think about what it would look like to have a diverse and inclusive Franklin County. I think all of this is to that end, right? To create diverse and inclusive communities, diverse and inclusive regions, diverse and inclusive Commonwealth, and we're proud to be partnering with FERCOG and you all to do this work. So you'll be hearing from myself and Whitney and Lily as we go through the evening. We will be watching a video that will be embedded in this, so we'll make sure to share the link to that video after the session as well. Just a little bit about CHAPA before we move on, so you know who we are and where we come from. If you're not familiar with us, CHAPA is a statewide affordable housing organization. We do work in a lot of different ways. Ultimately, the goal of our work, though, is to ensure that people have access to affordable homes that are appropriate for them in the communities that they choose. We do work at the federal and state level. The work that we do in our Municipal Engagement initiative, of which myself and Whitney and Lily are a part, is to move the needle on affordable housing and housing opportunity at the local level. So I think with that, I am going to hand it off to Lily to kick us off looking at Franklin County. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana. So I'm going to be starting us off tonight with just a little bit of a data overview of some county data that can hopefully kind of bring us all to the same page and make sure we have similar information as we head into the discussion portion of our evening. So Franklin County, these are probably all going to be facts that are pretty familiar to you as residents, is made up of 25 towns and 1 city. The population as of the 2020 census is 71,015, and those folks are spread across 34,436 housing units. The median household income is $61,198. You are served by the fabulous Franklin Regional Council of Governments, which is hosting us here tonight. The square mileage of the county is, I have heard, both 699 square miles from the US Census Bureau and 725 square miles from the FERCOG website. So somewhere between 699 and 725 square miles. And it is the most rural county in Massachusetts. So just to give you a sense of what that means and how it looks compared to the rest of the state, the threshold to be considered a rural community is having 500 people per square mile or less. And the population density in Franklin County as of 2020 was 101.6 people per square mile. So obviously very solidly in that rural category. And you can see here compared to the rest of the state as well. So we're going to start by looking at who lives in Franklin County. What are the demographics of Franklin County residents? As you can see, the population has been pretty stagnant over the past 30 years. We've really seen very little growth in Franklin County's population since the 90s. And even before, it was very slow growth, but things have really slowed down in the past few decades. Looking at the median age of residents in Franklin County, municipality by municipality, and thank you to our friends at FERCOG for making this map and some others that you'll see later. A reminder, if anyone's like, what does median mean again? It's the dead center. So half of the people who live in that community are under that median age and half of them are above it. And as we can see, in nearly every community, the median age is 40 or above. And in quite a few communities, the median age is folks in their 50s and 60s. So for example, community like Shelburne or Ashfield, that means half of residents are 55 or older, which is a pretty significant share of the pie. And we can see that that trend that we're seeing now of aging communities has occurred really over the past 20 years. Looking back at the 2000 census, the share of residents who were under 18 was 23.5%, and today it's 16.9 compared to the rest of the state, which is 19.5. And then the share of folks over 65 years was 14.2 in 2000 and is 23.9 today, meaning they've essentially switched. And again, looking at the state, there is a higher share of folks over 65 and a much smaller share of people under 18. So that looks a little bit at what the the age demographics of the county. I also wanted to look at the racial demographics across the county. As of 2012, Franklin County had the lowest share of minority population at 8%, along with Barnstable County. Minority population referring to anyone who is white, non-Hispanic. And we can see that at the state level, those people make up 24.2% of our overall population is non-white, whereas in Franklin County, it's about a third of that. We can see over time that there has been a small dip in the share of Franklin County residents that are white only, non-Hispanic. So there is a slow trend towards becoming more diverse, but still much higher representation of white residents than the rest of the state. We can also see in more detail how that breaks down in comparison to the state, looking at the share of residents who are Black, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic white. And we can see in just about every category, Franklin County has less representation of non-white residents than the rest of the state. So that gives us just a obviously teeny tiny taste of who is living in Franklin County. Obviously, that is not the whole story, but we can see a pretty significant trend of a lack of age diversity and a lack of racial diversity. So the next thing I wanted to look at is what housing is available to the people who live in Franklin County. We can see here a breakdown town by town of the housing units, or we like to say homes. We try to get away from saying units, but you'll definitely catch me saying it sometimes, by structure types. So meaning a single family detached, single family attached, 2 units, 3 to 4 apartments, 5 to 9 apartments, etc. And we can see that in most communities, the dominant housing type is single family detached. The really only exceptions being, towards the bottom of the screen in some of our more densely populated communities in the county. But in many, many places, the single family share makes up, over 90 or even close to 100%. We can also look at this broken down by the number of bedrooms per unit. So you can see, how many studio homes are available, how many 4-bedroom homes are available. And I think this chart also kind of helps illustrate how homes are spread out across the county. So you can see, this overrepresentation of housing opportunities in a few communities, whereas very few housing opportunities in some other communities. And so we've looked at who lives there, what kind of housing is available to them. And then when we kind of put these things together, we can ask, are folks able to afford that housing that is available to them? So here we can see another one of FERCOG's beautiful maps of median owner. So the median housing value for owner occupied units, meaning people who own their homes and live in the homes that they own. And we can see here that there's, in terms of the homes in the southern, kind of southwestern part of the county, seem to have higher median values than some other communities in the county. And as you look at this map and the next couple maps that I'm going to show you, I want to encourage people to take a minute just to reflect on maybe why some of these trends exist based off of your knowledge of where you live, the surrounding communities, and the county as a whole. What do you think might be some of the contributing factors to the patterns that you're going to see? And this is looking at the share of homeowners who are cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their gross income on housing costs, which for a homeowner would include mortgage, taxes, insurance, utilities. Anyone who is paying more than 30% of their gross income on those costs would be considered to be cost burdened. That's something we want to avoid. We think paying 30% or less keeps people in a safe, healthy, affordable space for them. And so we can see here that a fairly significant cost burden happening all around the entire county. Next, I wanted to look at how many rental units are available to people living in Franklin County. And we can see that when compared with the state, so the state average is 37.5% of homes are rentals. When we look at Franklin County, we can see that for the most part, communities are below that average. So we see kind of the majority of communities falling into that orange category, 11 to 20%. And we see the higher rates of rental housing available kind of in that cross shape that seems to be likely connected to the availability of the highways that run in those directions. But I'm sure there are many other reasons that you might be privy to as well. And then now we're going to look at the percentage of cost burden renters in Franklin County. And we can see, and we're going to do a side by side in a minute. But first, just looking at this alone, we can see pretty high rates of cost burdened renters, especially compared to the rates of cost burdened homeowners. It's really quite exceptionally high for renters. And I'll give you a minute to kind of take it in, and then we're going to be able to look at those two maps side by side. So here you can see the cost burdened homeowners on the left and cost burdened renters on the right. And we can see that well over half of the communities are in that 40% range or above, which is significant when you think about the idea that in some communities, 2/3 of people who are renting their homes are struggling to pay that cost. Is very notable. And you can also take a moment to kind of look at, where are places where rates of cost burden are high for both homeowners and renters. Where is it only true for one or the other? I think one thing that stands out is in Sunderland, there's actually pretty low rates of cost burden homeowners, but very high rates of cost burden renters. And so why might that be? And before we move on to this next portion of our evening, where we're going to show you a little video that we hope you enjoy and find informative, I just want to encourage folks to I know I just threw a lot of numbers and maps at you, to take a minute and just think about some of what you saw relating to age, relating to race, relating to the types of housing that is available, and the affordability of that housing. And if there's any kind of patterns that are starting to come together for you, I would encourage you to just jot that down, throw a thought in the chat. Please feel free to, I can see that chats are coming in, but I can't manage to read them and share my screen at the same time. But yeah, feel free. I want people to start kind of reflecting on that, because we will have the opportunity to have a discussion later. And on that note, I just wanted to check, Dana, is there anything you want to add before we just jump right into the video?
Yeah, I just want to introduce the video for a second while Lily is pulling it up. So I think the point of showing you all that data, as Lily was saying, is to set the stage for the rest of the conversation we're going to have. Data is one piece. You all also know your community in a different way. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about all of the pieces that Lily was asking you to think about. The other thing I want us to keep in mind is that communities happen by design. They don't happen in a vacuum. They don't just get created and plopped down out of nowhere. So these trends we're seeing, on aging or cost burden or how much housing is built. Those things happen by design. Someone somewhere along the way has had a hand in that happening. So this video that we're about to watch, I hope will be informative, and then we'll have some time to digest it after. So go ahead, Lily. Lily, I don't think the sound is playing.
Oh,
You just have to unshare and then reshare
okay.
with the sound.
We even practiced earlier and it worked.
You never know with Zoom.
Yeah. Let's see, share screen, share computer, sound. All right.
Notice that even in places where houses are usually expensive, even more expensive, like here in the San Francisco Bay Area.
What has the last year been like?
It's shocking. Buyers are paying 15 to 20% above asking price now. I had a listing in South San Francisco, 32 offers, 31 very unhappy buyers.
For years, the Bay Area has been an extreme example of how difficult it is to find affordable housing in the US. It's where Silicon Valley bus drivers sleep in their cars at night because they can't afford housing near work, and where school teachers can't afford to live in the counties they teach. But it's not just the Bay Area. The lack of affordable housing is a national problem, and right now it's worse than ever.
We've seen over the last year housing prices reach a level that they've never reached before in American history. They kind of just look like a rocket ship, going to the moon. Housing prices reaching a median of $350,000 for the median American home.
Those prices have made rents more expensive and have made homeownership less attainable for millions of Americans.
So, why is this happening? And how do we bring that rocket ship closer to Earth? We can think of today's housing prices in terms of a supply and demand problem. On the demand side, there are a few things happening. The first is a generational shift in who's buying homes.
Millennials are the biggest generation in American history, and they're aging into their prime home buying years.
On top of that, mortgage rates are at an all-time low, which means it's very cheap to borrow the money needed to buy a house. That's enticed more people to buy if they can, making demand for houses even higher. The problem is that supply isn't matching that demand. From 2010 to 2019, there were fewer homes built in the US than in any decade since the 1960s. In particular, the construction of smaller, entry-level housing, the kind made for first-time homebuyers, has dropped dramatically. In the 1980s, those starter homes made up around 40% of all homes built. Today, it's closer to 7%. In 2018, one estimate said the U.S. housing market was 2.5 million homes short of meeting demand. By the end of 2020, it was 3.8 million.
And that's driving a big part of the problem, both for renters and for people who want to be homeowners.
The shortage is worst in the places where demand is highest, near good jobs, transit, and schools. And one pretty straightforward solution to that is to just build more homes in those places. But for years, there's been one big obstacle to that. We aren't allowed to. Take a look at this map of the Bay Area. It's showing something called zoning, or local regulations that decide what can be built where. This much of the region is zoned for residential housing. In blue are areas zoned to allow multifamily housing, while the areas shaded in pink are zoned for single-family housing only. That's 82% of all residential land in the Bay Area.
What it means is that you've banned the ability for anyone to build anything other than a single unit of housing on that lot of land.
And in many towns, like Atherton, they've excluded all multifamily housing from their neighborhoods.
And that doesn't just mean a giant apartment building. It means things like duplexes, things like, fourplexes, things like that are illegal in the majority of the country.
This is an example of something called exclusionary zoning. It's a big part of the reason for the housing supply shortage in the US. And single-family only zoning is just one way local laws limit how much housing we can build. Many places also employ height restrictions. In Cupertino, California, some areas are zoned for multifamily buildings, but they don't allow any buildings over 2 stories. Parking requirements are often written into zoning laws too. Cupertino requires developers to set aside space for 2 parking spaces for each unit of multifamily housing. That means if you were building an apartment complex that had 100 units, you'd need to find space for 200 parking spots, which usually means buildings that size don't get built at all.
They lower the number of units they're actually building so they can save space for those parking spaces. And then those units become more expensive because the land still stays the same cost to the developer. And you then get a situation where potentially more affordable units turn into higher income servicing units.
Another feature of many zoning laws is minimum lot sizes. It means builders are legally required to allot a minimum amount of land for each home, often a large amount of land. In Cupertino, most single-family lots must be at least 5,000 square feet each.
Starter homes are usually around 1,400 to 1,500 square feet, and so you've basically banned all that type of housing.
In Atherton, the minimum lot size for homes is 1 acre, more than 43,000 square feet, which makes it virtually impossible to build any kind of affordable home there. Together, exclusionary zoning laws like this push builders across the country to focus on bigger luxury homes instead of smaller starter homes or multifamily housing.
Essentially creating gated communities in public spaces. What you are saying is that you are only allowing people who have already been able to partake in the wealth of this country and to grow their income and have access to high opportunity jobs and education to live in our neighborhoods.
Historically, some of the first zoning laws in the US were engineered for that exactly, to block people of color, and in particular Black Americans, from living in predominantly white neighborhoods. Today, the laws don't explicitly mention race, but they continue to worsen segregation. In the Bay Area, the more single-family zoning in a neighborhood, the wider it is. But all this has another effect as well. By shrinking the pot of new housing getting built, while demand keeps rising, it drives up the cost of housing for everyone. Changing zoning laws can be difficult, and often the biggest obstacles are the wealthiest residents.
The process is usually defined by who shows up to these public meetings, and what you have is often a much whiter, wealthier crowd, the ones who come and say, I don't want this in my community, I'm concerned about what will happen to my property values, and then there's this kind of code word, neighborhood character.
Remember those teachers I mentioned who can't afford to live in the counties where they teach? Well, in 2018, one local school district proposed a solution: building affordable housing units for teachers in San Jose. It caused an uproar among San Jose parents, who petitioned against changing the neighborhood. It may not seem like a big deal when one wealthy neighborhood blocks one multifamily development. The problem is that it happens all the time. Communities block new housing everywhere.
People are, when they hear this kind of rhetoric, very confused because they're like, why I don't want to live in a place with 10,000 apartment buildings. It doesn't even make sense to do that. And they're right. No one is saying that there should be every neighborhood in every city should be, 10,000 foot apartment buildings or anything like that.
But even small, gradual changes to zoning laws can have an impact. For example, allowing smaller homes on smaller lots, or simply allowing duplexes, would double capacity for housing in some areas. In recent years, some cities like Berkeley, Minneapolis, and Portland have taken the huge step of ending single-family zoning. But the problem is nationwide.
The real fix is going to happen when these decisions start being made and start being regulated at the statewide level or at the federal level in some capacity.
Today, the Biden administration is attempting to tackle exclusionary zoning through a $5 billion program that would give money to localities that remove exclusionary zoning policies. But even that may not be enough.
This is more than any presidential administration has done on this topic, either Democrat or Republican. It is also very small in the face of this problem. They want to take action, they recognize how big of a deal it is, but they are not actually willing to create the kind of political blowback from often very high-value voters living in suburban environments.
Ending America's housing shortage will require real political willpower. And it'll require people across the country to take a look at their own neighborhoods. What gets built, who gets excluded, and how to make homeownership achievable for the millions who are shut out.
All right. Thank you, Lily, for sharing that video. And we'll get back to our presentation in a minute, but we want to take a little bit of time to process with you some thoughts and what you saw in that video. I wanted to lead with this last question. It's hard. I want to make a note. It's really hard to find a video that talks about all these topics that also feels relevant to every type of community that we work in, right? So some communities we work in are very urban, they're already very dense, they already have a lot of people who are low income living in them and they're worried about displacement. Some places like Franklin County are much more rural, maybe have you know, a lower threshold for high density development, but there's still a nugget, I think, of this, the importance of this video for every community that we work in. And I think this last question that Jerusalem Densas, who did a lot of the reporting to put this video together, asked is what's most important for our conversation here today in the context of the data that Lily has already shared with you, which is, I'm going to put it in the chat, what gets built and who gets excluded. So I want to start with some of your reflections. We're going to spend maybe 10 minutes here talking about this video before we move on to our next section. Your reflections on the video and thinking about your community, Franklin County as a whole, what gets built and who gets excluded from those opportunities under the status quo or the current status here in Franklin County. Anyone, feel free to raise your virtual hand, raise your real hand. I'll also move to the chat, but I see Elizabeth, go ahead.
People who are in a situation where they don't have money, don't have credit, perhaps they were in a bad marriage and everything went to you know where, or just some kind of disaster, whatever hit somebody hard, and it happens to a lot of people now. Once you're knocked down, it takes decades to crawl back up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the video makes it very clear how wealth is concentrated and wealth begets wealth, and those who are not able to get into that are further and further excluded the more we don't build what is needed to safely and affordably house people. Great point. Susan, go ahead.
I think for Franklin County, it's a little more complicated because there are state rules that make it very difficult for many of the smaller towns. I'm thinking of things like issues around sewage systems and such that make it more difficult for the smaller communities to build new and build up, even if it's 2 or 3 family. The difficulty of being in a town where everybody is on septic, and the only way that new building can happen is if a sewage system is set up. If you want to see a community go against an affordable housing project, just ask them to pay for something that they can't use. Mm-hmm. So I think that for us, it's a little more complicated. It's not true in Greenfield. It's not true in some of in Turner's, but it is true in other parts of Franklin County.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. So there's kind of the 4 pieces that the video talked about around parking and height restrictions and minimum lots and multifamily being banned, but it's also what are the other barriers that you have keeping you from being able to create the type of housing and the scale of housing that you want. Infrastructure is absolutely a point to keep in mind. I also saw someone in the video, or while we were watching the video in the chat, talking about transit options. So, you know, if people are car reliant, then they might need 1 or 2 parking spaces per unit, but if they have good public transit, they might be able to reduce that reliance on cars. So I think I would add that to the list of the barriers that are keeping Greenfield or not Greenfield, but non-Greenfield communities in Franklin County from being able to create their housing. But I wouldn't say it's a barrier that we can't overcome, or maybe, you know, talking about just a duplex or an accessory dwelling unit, this kind of light density or lighter multifamily options that could work in some communities. Other thoughts, other reflections on what this looks like for your community or what it brought up for you? Beth, I see you.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so I'm from Conway. I work with the planning board, and this brought up a lot of interesting things for me. One thing that I've noticed, and I'm not sure if the data is proving it out yet, but over the last, I'd say 10 years, even though Conway always was a town with a lot of second houses for people, it feels like even more of the homes that are here are unoccupied a lot of the time. And additionally, just in the hill towns in general, things that maybe previously were rental units seem to be, short stay vacation units. So I think that exacerbates the problem. In Conway, we changed the minimum acreage. We, halved it. So it's 1 acre. It used to be 2 acres. Now it's 1 acre. I know they pointed out 1 acre, but that was a big change for us. We do have the ability for any house to have 2 apartments in it as well as a primary. And we talked about doing a detached accessory dwelling unit, but several of us remained pretty concerned that there wouldn't be a way to make that have the outcome that we were hoping for by increasing housing for people who possibly couldn't afford something else or were elderly and wanted to downsize. We were afraid. I remain nervous about that, but we're willing to take it up again and discuss it and bring it to the town.
Yeah.
So a detached, but again, as somebody pointed out really sensibly, septic system costs add a tremendous amount of cost. And if you were building a detached unit, you'd have to build a secondary septic.
Yeah, which may not cover the cost.
Which is a minimum of $30,000 now. A minimum.
You're raising a lot of really good points here. So I want to just first of all acknowledge that and see. I don't know if we have the data off the top of our heads on the number of homes in the county that are second homes and the number of homes that are used for short-term rentals. But I see Jen saying in the chat that there's some data on the short-term rental trend, which would be helpful to share. On the question about detached accessory dwelling units, it's a point well taken. We can also share some reports on kind of the best practices around that. We have seen some communities work to make sure that accessory dwelling units are not used as a short-term rental option so that it does become an actual full year-round living space for someone. And there are some communities that are thinking about how to make that more affordable so that you can actually ensure that they are affordable options. The Cape is doing some innovative stuff around that. And some other communities are using things like CPA funds in order to buy down the cost so that those units actually become affordable. So I'd love where you guys are thinking of going in Conway, and we'd love to support you in continuing those conversations. And yeah, I think, going from 2 acre zoning to 1 acre zoning, that is a big thing, right? That's double the capacity of housing on any given lot. One of the things that I think hasn't been mentioned is this idea of, especially in rural or small towns, about where is it that you encourage housing. So if you do have a village center, if you do have a commercial district, if you do have a place where public transit is accessible, having slightly higher ability to create housing, more units, more homes near that, and then maybe allowing single family with a duplex everywhere, or single family with an accessory dwelling unit everywhere. But thinking about those smart growth principles. There was someone in the chat, I think, mentioned something about, vulnerable sustainability resources. We do want to be thinking about that. There's an intersection around housing and zoning and walkability and sustainability, and all of those things really interact well together. Any other comments before we move on? Phoebe, go ahead.
I guess one other thing I think is at play in our region. I mean, two other things worth mentioning. One, they talk about the average home price being 350,000, or rather the median home price, which for Massachusetts, I think it just hit 600,000. So that's driving people with incomes far beyond what people who grew up potentially in Franklin County, have out here to pay what probably looks reasonable to the people who made that video prices for homes, but price everyone else out. And the other is just the really intense cultural goal of owning your own home. We have done some interviews with folks through this project who are leaving incarceration, leaving substance use treatment, about what their vision is for their future. And everybody has this vision that they will own their own home. And those four walls are expensive to build all by themselves versus even for a septic system like Susan was talking about. You can make a septic system for a 3-unit place. You know what I mean? You can totally do that. It's an economy of scale that absolutely works. But if nobody wants to share a bill, if everyone's dream is individual homes, that makes it harder. And this is a rural area where that's the norm.
Yeah, I think that's two really important points that we should continue to have those conversations about. One thing I want to say is that sometimes it's just a visioning exercise, right? Like there can be really thoughtfully designed multifamily buildings that still give people a little sense of their own space. If there's a little shared outdoor space or their own individual outdoor space. One of the communities we work with, which is very different than Franklin County, Chelsea, still in that community, most people, when we talk to them about their vision, they wanted their own personal outdoor space, even if that meant just a deck off the back of their apartment or a roof deck or a little garden where they could garden. It looks different for everyone, but I think those points are important. And I saw in the chat, folks were asking about the best practices on ADUs. We will definitely share that report in the follow-up. So I see Jen and then Andrea, and then I think we'll move on to the next portion of our session.
Thanks, Dana. I just wanted to add in that, I think in our communities, we have significant opportunities to be able to renovate and rehabilitate buildings that can become multi-unit buildings. But when I think about it, all the examples that I can think of where we've recently used municipal and state programs to do that renovation and rehabilitation, the developers who've sort of had the capital to be able to participate have not chosen or felt it was economically viable to turn those into affordable units. Yeah. So like I think it's important to try to figure out how can we create deeded affordable housing and naturally affordable housing that doesn't rely on the private real estate development market. It was alluded to in the video, but it is certainly happening here that, the investment in building is investment in market rate and above market rate apartments.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. And we asked the question as I kicked off this portion, what gets built and who gets excluded? So some things will get built without any public interventions, without any incentives. Some things will not. So when we think about what's not getting built, what is the unmet need? That's where we may need to offer more financial incentives, more zoning incentives, more tax incentives, whatever tool we have to throw at that issue to compel the creation of the housing that meets those needs is really important. So I see a bunch of questions. I just want to do a time check because we are going to do a little more presentation and then there is a lot of time at the end of our session for discussion. So if there are points about the video, I would love to take them now. But otherwise I might ask that we hold them and we'll get through the rest of the session and then come back to these conversations because they are really fruitful. Andrea, do you want to make a comment before we move on?
I had a few comments on some of the topics we've been talking about, but it can wait till the end. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Lily.
I was just going to say one quick thing. One of the things that why we're really happy to be having this discussion is that there is a lack of research and resources about how to address these problems in a rural context. There is simply a lack of data and examples we can turn to. That's why we showed you a video that talked about San Francisco, because there unfortunately aren't the same kind of just quantity and quality of content out there that is really specifically for communities like Franklin County. And so we hope that this evening and this conversation can be an opportunity to take those sort of general best practices that, of course, ultimately, supply and demand is a force that is going to be true in any place, but there are many, many components that are just going to be so specific to you all. And so, yeah, we want to, this is not just for us to teach you something, it's also for us to collaboratively try to figure out what this can really look like so we can make it happen.
So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Whitney. We'll restart our presentation and he will talk a little bit about, how do we try to have an impact in different communities, and what kind of impact can you all have as you have these questions going through your head? What do we encourage you to do with all of that? So I'll hand it off to you, Whitney.
Thanks so much, Dana. Happy and excited to be part of this conversation, right? And thinking about, again, what gets built and who gets excluded. So I'll talk a little bit about the role of community engagement and to the points made, try to get a little bit more in our backyard in terms of a Massachusetts context of some research that has happened in this space. And so there's a report, book, The Neighborhood Defenders, Participatory Politics and America's Housing Crisis. It was put together by Professor Katie Einstein, David Glick, and Maxwell Palmer. And basically what it does is it compares voters with commenters in terms of disproportionately being white, male, older homeowners, right? Folks who's participating in these public processes. And so these trends sort of persist in high and low cost cities, right? And contribute to inadequate housing supply and in highly desirable communities or more affluent communities. It did look at 97 cities or towns in Eastern Massachusetts, so not quite in your neck of the woods, but certainly a better context in terms of the state. And so it really shows that neighborhood defense and advantage neighborhoods pushes development really into more less affluent communities, right? And this sort of has larger impacts in terms of leading to gentrification and displacement, right? And so while neighbors of all viewpoints, of course, are welcome to participate in public process, what we find is that individuals who do participate oftentimes hold overwhelmingly negative views on new housing. And so this does have an effect then on other less affluent communities. And so on this slide, it sort of shows the differences between the commenters and actual voters, right? And so what the study did was dig into sort of the comments using a variety of public records to estimate age and voting history and other factors, such as whether people own their homes or not. And really you'll note here that voters tend to be more likely to be white, older, male homeowners, right? And you'll also note that, again, another thing they sort of point out in the research is that even in comparing commenters to actual voters who participate in the voting process, there still really is that difference. But then also you remember that oftentimes folks who are closest to the need don't necessarily vote as well. So there is sort of a missing piece here in terms of who is participating, right? And then on the next slide, you'll notice that people who show up to those meetings, again, are overwhelmingly opposed to construction of new housing, right? So the majority are opposed to multifamily housing in every town in those 97 communities. And so the bigger picture to this is that oftentimes, although the folks who come out and make comment are opposed to projects, it also becomes out of whack in terms of the larger public opinion. Folks who are agreeable to new construction, to new housing, to multifamily housing are not necessarily participating in the public process. And sort of course, this really blocks the ability to diversify housing stock and affects housing supply, which has really larger impacts on the community. So on the next slide, you'll note some additional differences found in the report in terms of differences in support by race and by home ownership. And so you'll note here from this chart in the report that non-homeowners are more likely to be supportive, and non-whites are also more likely to be supportive of new housing construction and development. And so in our work, we are sort of challenged with this, and part of why we do the work that we do, you'll find on the next slide here, is really to disrupt that, right? How do we disrupt that sort of trend? And Lily, if you could advance the slide, I just wanted to share a little bit about sort of our goal in the Municipal Engagement Initiative is really to make sure that community support is active, right? That we activate folks who are not so much the usual suspects of folks who participate in public process, because we know that that community support can really make or break whether or not housing development gets built on the local level, right? Many communities, though, don't have an organized coalition that comes out in support of these various things. And so that's part of the work that we strive to do, is to build coalitions that really understand their role here. And so part of how we do that is through a coalition building model, right? So we are bringing together not only municipal staff and elected officials, but rental residents, right? And homeowners. How do we bring both of those voices to the context of the work that we're doing? As well as housing advocates and developers, local businesses, civic groups, houses of worship, environmentalist groups, service providers, cultural groups, as well as Black Lives Matter supporters, right? How do we bring together the various voices, and how our interest really does overlap with housing, and really be able to build a broader coalition that really becomes sustainable, even past just one particular development or zoning policy that can get passed, but really begins to be able to weigh in on various housing efforts. And so we've been excited to be in Franklin County, and as well in other communities like Revere. You'll note the picture here on the left is one of the communities that we are active in. And success looks different for each community, right? Franklin County is unique from many other regions, and certainly what is true about every community is that every community is unique, right? It has its own challenges. But the way that we measure success is that a coalition actually does get built. We're able to build a broad coalition of folks who come together on these efforts and make their voices heard, particularly in public meeting process, but also, throughout the year, throughout various moments to participate, whether it's through op-eds or or meeting with their municipal staff, right, to talk about a particular issue, or to join a housing trust committee or what have you. The other part of success really is, like, does housing get built, right? We see that as a success, and also, of course, the goal of many of the coalitions is to be able to house people, right? Really putting an onus on putting people first. And so if you just to go to the next slide, we oftentimes will talk with groups about how do they get started, where do I go from here? We certainly want to have a coalition that can be activated to show up and say, yes, we want this new zoning, or this, yes, we want this sewage, which will allow for us to build more housing in the future. And how do we activate folks to do that? Well, we talk about a few things. Identify some core partners, right? Go through that list of different types of stakeholders in the community and how you can sort of build a coalition in that way. Begin to have these community conversations. Certainly use the data to your advantage about what you already know about your community and which you love, right? Dana mentioned the visioning exercise, right? What do we want Greenfield to look like? What do we want our communities, urban, to look like in the next 10 years? What do we love about our community? So I think that's a great place to start, because it's often a place where we often agree and we can see it as something that can be doable, that we can do together, especially when we see other examples of communities who've done it, right? So then just get started. You launch an event, you have a meeting, and you make sure that your process is inclusive, to make sure that you have different voices at the table, right? Talk about the communities in Franklin County sort of changing in the terms of its demographics. And so other things should be changing too. And how do we make sure that we have that growth and certainly take action? And so we're excited to really just be part of varying efforts. And so in Franklin County, and I certainly want to talk a little bit more next about encouraging diverse housing options. So I will throw it over to Dana.
Thank you, Whitney. So I think what's important as we move into kind of the next phase of this conversation is to go back to that question we asked you in the chat to start this conversation. What does a diverse and inclusive community look like to you? And moving to the next step is, how do our housing efforts support or prevent that? And what do we need to change in order to move closer to that vision? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those housing strategies, but we always try to encourage, with all of this information we're sharing with you, anytime you're evaluating a policy, a program, a zoning change, an effort to fund something, think about, are we moving ourselves closer to that vision, or are we preventing ourselves from being able to achieve that vision? That's the rubric that we should be using as we evaluate all of these strategies. So let's talk about some of the strategies that are already here in your region. You heard at the beginning of the call, there was a discussion about the IH2 program, Improving Housing to Improve Health. This is a 5-year initiative that FRCOG is undertaking. And these are some of the housing efforts that are included in that already. So number one, increasing the capacity to redevelop and rehabilitate buildings. And I think Jen raised an important point. It's not just about redeveloping and rehabilitating those buildings, but making sure that the end user, the person who lives in that home, is supported, that it's affordable, that it meets the needs of the community. A strategy to provide technical assistance to local land use boards and committees to support policy change and implementation. So this can take the form of zoning. It can take the form of housing production plans or passage of the Community Preservation Act. It could take the form of a fair housing marketing plan. It could take the form of finding new revenue sources, launching an affordable housing trust, whatever it may be. There's an acknowledgement that in small communities, small towns, the capacity to do all of this really important and critical work may be limited. So providing that technical assistance so that if there's something you're curious about pursuing in your community, there are people, there are resources out there to help you move those forward. Supporting the growth and development of community-based coalitions that are focused on housing, that's where we come in. We've been working with folks in Greenfield, with folks in Montague. We're excited to work with others. If you're interested in that, we will let you know how to reach out, but Lily will be the point person whether that looks like helping you with that full-on engagement of launching a coalition, or if it just means providing some resources, one-pagers and FAQs so that you can talk to your neighbors about creating a coalition. We want to support you in that. And then increasing that community engagement in support of those efforts. And then I think what we're talking about here tonight is identifying, addressing, and removing those systemic and institutional barriers that limit access to housing. So some of them we presented to you and the video presented. Others you guys raised in that conversation about, you know, infrastructure issues, or you know, you fall on hard times and you can't pick yourselves back up. You know, people being shut out of the system because of a criminal background or a substance abuse history. What are the various barriers that we can be working to break down? Simply identifying them is the first step, and then we have to then address each of those barriers. I want to share some other additional strategies that communities in Franklin County may want to explore. Again, these are, every community is unique. Every community has their own history and their own land use and their own housing market, but these are things that are really worth exploring in any community, I think. So we talked about how, you know, development may, if we remove a lot of the barriers, development might happen, but it will likely be market rate development. So how do we then add on additional incentives to ensure affordability within that market rate development? Are we giving density bonuses? Are we reducing parking requirements? Are we waiving permit fees? Are we fast tracking development if it's 100% affordable? We encourage every community to have a fair housing plan. Sometimes you just don't know what the barriers are to creating housing that is equitable and inclusive if you don't ask those questions. So there's some great examples of other communities that have done this that we would love to connect you up with. Arlington is kind of the one we've been holding up as a really great example. So we can share in the chat and in the notes later what their fair housing planning effort looked like. But I think it's a really important piece for everyone to look at. Related to that, we talk about reviewing your local preferences. So in many communities, when they create new affordable housing, they add a restriction or a preference for people to move into those homes or those apartments to already be someone who lives in that community, a local preference. So for people who live or work in that community, they kind of get first dibs on those homes. And while that is really beneficial to create homes for people who already live, and as you saw from Lily's data, many people in your towns are cost burdened and could benefit from that affordability. It also means look at those local preferences. Are you keeping people out of your community by implementing those? Does it mean that people who don't already have the opportunity to live in your community will not be able to enjoy that benefit going forward? And I do see something in the chat about how local preferences are only on first lease up. It's not ongoing, which is an important point. But we can talk a little bit more about the nuances of that, but I appreciate you raising that MJ. Legalizing multifamily in more zones. This is what the crux of the video that we watched was, and that can look different in every community. It might mean allowing up to 4, up to 10 units in every zone. It might mean adding accessory dwelling units as by right in every zone. It might mean duplexes. It looks different in every community. Affordable housing trusts and community land trusts are two tools that many communities employ to create more affordability in particular. So an affordable housing trust is a tool that any community in Massachusetts is enabled to implement through a vote of your local council, town meeting, whatever your mechanism may be. And they can take in money from various sources. That might be Community Preservation Act funds, it might be donations, it might be some communities actually put city budget or town budget dollars into affordable housing trust funds. And that money is used to do a variety of things. It can fund development, it can fund rental assistance, it can fund buy down programs to make homes more affordable to people who are low income. And Community Land Trust kind of approaches it from a different angle, which is where they essentially purchase the land and make the land affordable so that anything you build on it can be more affordable. And we can talk to you about both of those tools. I know there's an effort happening in Franklin County around community land trust as well, which is really exciting. You can allocate significant resources to affordable housing. A lot of people say, you know, money talks. So if you have money in your municipal budget, or you have access to funds, putting that money towards affordable housing goes a long way. It costs the same amount to build an affordable unit as it does a market rate unit. And somehow we need to bring that price down in order to make it affordable for people to either buy or rent those homes. One thing that's really important when we're talking about the intersection between housing and sustainability and smart growth principles is zoning for greater density in walkable village centers. So thinking about where do people have access to resources like a grocery store, a library, a school, a senior center. All of those places are where you should be thinking about higher density or clustering of homes, or maybe reducing parking requirements in order to allow more housing. And another way that communities do this kind of work is thinking about top of the shop apartments. So you may have a downtown district that's, you know, 1-story or maybe 2-story commercial. Adding some apartments to the top of those, or allowing apartments within those more traditional economic centers, can be a really great way to both create more affordability, more scale, and reduce reliance on cars. And speaking of cars, always thinking to review parking minimums. So it can be very expensive, especially when we're talking about creating multifamily housing, to provide parking at the extent that many zoning ordinances require. And so when we think about, we're weighing, we talk a lot about it in terms of, you know, the benefit of one thing versus the other. So if we're talking about, can we have more homes and less parking, or more parking and less homes, we really encourage communities to think about that, so that they are prioritizing housing over parking. And if there are things that you need to do in your community to improve walkability and improve transit access, partnering those with that affordability and higher density is really critical. I see a lot going on in the chat, which I haven't been able to take in as I've been talking, but I want to add those to the strategies, because I can already tell there are things happening here that we could add to the strategies. So one piece that we always talk about, if we can move on to the next slide, I think. When we talk about municipal engagement, we specifically named our program Municipal Engagement Initiative, not Community Engagement Initiative. We feel there's a role for the municipal officials to fill in this work, and a role for community advocates to fill in this work. And so if you're here and you're filling the role of a municipal official, this is a laundry list of things that you might want to be thinking about as we continue these conversations in your town. So fair housing plans certainly should be you know, initiated through the municipality. Hosting community conversations such as this on housing and racism and segregation is a role that you could take. Supporting coalition building efforts are really important. Looking at your local preference criteria is a great place to start. Doing the data collection. You guys are lucky that you have a group like FERCog that has a lot of that data, but taking a look at the additional things that maybe are missing and maybe have to be filled in, and providing that data. And lastly, there's a role to be had for managing public meetings to support inclusion. And someone earlier up in the chat, I'll go back and find it, said, you know, early on in their life, when they were younger, they didn't have the time to go to public meetings. There's a lot of reasons why people don't show up to talk about the need for more housing, the need for more housing opportunity, affordability. One of them is that, and we can share a report that speaks to this topic in particular, is that often people are just not ever asked. And then sometimes when they do show up, they are made to feel like, oh, you know, you haven't lived here for 25 years. You haven't lived here your whole life. You don't own a home. You know, you're struggling. Maybe you don't look like the people who are already in this room. is your voice as valid as all the other people who are in here? And if we don't manage public meetings to support that inclusion, even when people come to their first meeting to share what they want to say and support housing and affordability, they may not come back. And so there's a real role for municipal officials to set the tone and to make sure that that is not the way that public meetings are run, so that we can hear from everyone and encourage that participation. There's also a critical role for community advocates, and I know many of you here tonight are community advocates. So for you all to be focusing on, you are the ones who will turn out people to address the lack of diversity and representation. You should be pushing for your boards themselves to be more representative of your community. So if you have a public board that is all homeowners, maybe supporting the appointment of someone who's a renter to that board to get that point of view, making sure that the demographic diversity reflects the community. You have the role of eliminating barriers to engagement. So that might mean for your community offering materials in other languages. It might mean giving people rides to public meetings to speak. It might mean doing educational efforts before a meeting in order to make sure people feel confident speaking. It might mean changing the time of meetings and the location of meetings to make them more accessible, going to people where they are to seek their input. You have a big role to create welcoming communities, and that can be done in a variety of ways. You can seek out the stories of those most affected. We have some great tools to do that, but really getting to know people who are themselves who would benefit from more housing affordability, who themselves are facing housing instability. Those stories can be really impactful, and oftentimes people just haven't been asked to share them, or they haven't been given a forum in which they feel safe to share them. Educating residents on the public processes and the input points. It is a complicated process to, for example, change zoning, right? Someone needs to create the idea of zoning, someone needs to draft it, someone needs to bring it before the board, there's 30-day notice, there's 2 minutes of public hearings at the beginning of the meeting, there's the time to respond. As a citizen or resident of a community, how do I know where I have the ability to have input? So helping people understand that and giving them the resources to do that. You can really find allies in unexpected places. So we at the Municipal Engagement Initiative really see housing as kind of the hub of everything that happens in our communities. If you can't live there and you can't do so affordably and sustainably, you can't have access to all of the other benefits that are in your community. And so helping the business community to see that, sustainable, affordable housing helps them be able to keep their businesses running, to keep staff in their businesses. Sustainability, green groups understand that, housing has a role to play in our carbon footprint, and where we build our housing has a role to play in our reliance on cars. So definitely thinking outside of the box. If you're not engaged in housing already, that does not mean you cannot be engaged. And we always try to tell people, if you've ever rented a home, bought a home, sold a home, struggled to meet the rent, struggled to get the mortgage paid, you are a housing expert in and of itself, you in your own right, and you have a role in this work. And then lastly, to work with existing groups, community groups, churches, service organizations that are already out there. There are so many people in every community doing really important work. They are the best source of information about what is lacking, what benefits and opportunities you have in your community. So building community with those already existing groups is really critical for community advocates. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Lily, and we've got a little bit of time left to continue the discussion that we've been having.
Sorry, 1 second. I could not find that unmute button. Okay. So yes, now we want to bring you all back into the conversation, and I am going to stop sharing my screen in a moment so we can all see each other's faces. I believe Whitney will be putting these into the chat for us. But yeah, bringing it back to the group. What opportunities are there for Franklin County to create more diverse housing opportunities, knowing the unique challenges and opportunities that you have in your community right now. Who do you typically see in the room for these housing related decisions, and who is missing that you would like to get into that space? What are some methods you might use to make those meeting spaces more welcoming and inclusive for renters, maybe for folks who are newer to the community, people who might have previously felt like that space was not for them? And lastly, what are the opportunities for residents to demonstrate that support? So once you've made these inclusive, welcoming spaces where people are able to and want to come and participate, what can you do with those folks that you have gathered? So I know we're sort of hitting it at a couple different angles, but just looking at the time, I kind of wanted to throw it all at you, and feel free to respond to whatever feels most interesting to you. Yeah, Rob, jump on in.
It's tough speaking to a group of professionals that have heard many things before, but of course, many of the subsidized housing units have community centers that we can access. And even though if you're utilizing a subsidized housing community center, you say, well, everybody that's going to come to it's already housed. But word of mouth is gold. And just to keep that in mind, going to hold something on housing, why not hold it right where you're going to be the most effective?
Yeah, absolutely. Making it as easy as possible for people to attend. And also, I think the benefit of that is that they will probably feel more safe and comfortable if it's their turf. Yeah, I love that idea. Shondell.
Hi, tapping into resources. I mean, a community center to have local resources come out to existing locations is good and all. I would also say, advancing the work of, landlord engagement, making sure that landlords understand what Section 8 is, what permanent supportive housing is, what rapid rehousing is, what funds there are to house the homeless or people that are in, at dire straits and can't afford their regular housing. I will say that, working with the community on certain different outlooks has been very fruitful when it comes to landlords, existing property owners, existing folks that, are maybe because of the COVID situation are weary of renting to other populations that are not the local population.
Thank you. Yeah, and as Rob pointed out, there is absolutely still a lot of discrimination against folks who are using housing vouchers. Susan.
I think we also have to dispel some myths. Because someone doesn't have money doesn't mean that they are a horrible person, doesn't mean that they are automatically a user of drugs, doesn't mean that they will be a problem to the community. And that's a big order, because in a community, in communities where there aren't not where new people in particular are assumed to be problems rather than positives, and it takes a lot of guts for people to say, no, that's not the way things actually are. And that's particularly true when we start looking at affordable housing, and when we start looking, because affordable housing is seen as being poor people's housing for folks who are outside and are coming into the community, rather than recognizing that we have low-income folks in our own communities who are not able, who are doubling up in apartments or are not able to meet the rent or need different kinds of housing than we have right now.
Yeah, we've definitely found going back to that idea of seeking out stories, we've found it to be very effective in a lot of communities to share stories of real people already living in the community who are struggling with their housing costs. That server at your favorite diner that makes your day every Sunday morning when you go there. Those are the people who are already providing value and might be struggling with their housing costs. Yeah, Deborah.
Thank you. I would also note, in addition to the good comments that have been shared, just the impact of trauma and how that plays out in someone's life over the course of their life. And so the research behind this is really clear, and I think it obviously has implications for housing down the road for folks. And as the article that I put in the chat also really examining those market and other forces that really have led to an underfunding in housing across the country has also further pushed people who are already at the margins trying to survive even further back. And so that puts a lot of stress on people. And I think that as a caring and hopefully caring community, I think we need to create options and places for people to have more equity so that folks can participate in rental and other housing opportunities, regardless of the trauma they've experienced in their lives.
I want to take a second because someone raised a question about some of the terminology we're using. So I do want to just make a quick clarity point here because if one person has raised it, there may be others. I just heard something at an event I was at called the jargon dragon. Like, just raise your hand if someone's using a term that you've never heard. We flag it because we aren't all speaking from the same level of background with these various pieces. And it is really important when we talk about affordable. So in general, housing is considered affordable if you're not paying more than 30% of your income towards housing. That's kind of the general category. But when we talk about affordable housing in this context, we're generally talking about housing that is affordable to someone who is low income. So it is restricted in some way so that someone who's low income would be paying no more than 30% of their income on housing. Section 8 is one tool that we use in order to create affordability. It's essentially a voucher that you can use to pay down the cost of an apartment so that you pay 30% of your income and the voucher pays the difference. That is a very, very short answer to that question, which is much more complicated. And so I put in the chat, we offer an affordable housing 101 session. You are all welcome to join us for that. And if there's a benefit of offering something like that that is more Franklin County specific, we would be happy to work with you all to do that.
Thank you, Dana. Jerry.
I couple of things. One is I think it's, you were talking earlier in one of the slides was talking about making planning board and select board meetings, etc., more accessible to the population. I would urge folks to also talk about getting volunteers in to take these positions. You know, in this part of the world, everything is done by volunteer. Not, but a lot of regulation of land use proposals, of change amendments to the zoning bylaws for town A, B, or C. They start with state regs, but then it's refined and depends on the votes in terms of what gets done. It's easier now, given the changes in the zoning requirements, to get a zoning amendment through. You don't need a 2/3 majority anymore. You just need a majority. So passing legislation like, let's say, backlot bylaws, which save frontage land for more dense backlot development, is one technique that a couple of towns have adopted. Doesn't seem to be used much. There are lots of moving parts here, but I want to make 2 points. One is that in addition to trying to bring more people into the system, it's also important for people to be part of the system. to be part of and run for office and make those commitments if you've got the time. I certainly have over the years. I've learned a lot. I've been associated with, the planning board in my little town and the Franklin Regional Planning Board for like 24 years now. And I can tell you that I've seen this kind of turn of valiant effort to turn around this Titanic that we've got called the housing catastrophe. And it isn't working too well. Unfortunately, we've had some really rough patches. And I would just mention, as a former contractor as well, that the 2008 recession combined with COVID has pretty much cleaned the clock of a lot of professionals out there who basically got out of the business. Everything from roofing to plumbing to electrical to contractors who built, myself. It was traumatic. But now we're out of that. We're facing an even worse catastrophe for the housing issue. And I don't see a lot changing. One recent experience I'll share real quick is that I've been really disappointed in our both Greenfield and Montague areas dealing with reusing existing structures for housing that is badly needed. Referring in Montague to Farron and in Greenfield, we'll see what happens to the armory. It was just sold. I don't know who bought it, but I certainly did whatever I could to get developers who were interested in housing for that structure to make a bid. So the kind of work we have to do has to reach beyond our comfort zone, bring people into the back rooms and make it public so that we can actually make some changes here. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry. And I just looked at the clock, it's 7:30 already. But I was going to say that, yeah, I wanted to, since Shondell has her hand raised, I wanted to give her the opportunity to speak. And then we'll wrap things up.
I just wanted to piggyback off of so many great ideas that are being thrown on the table right now, is also remember to include the people that are in these communities, but not only the people in these communities, but being more of a forward thinking group of folks that are not only looking at maximizing housing, but having people that have gone through different situations in the communities, whether it be eviction, whether it be housing, whether insecurity, food insecurity, people of color, being more inclusive and moving away from, and a lot of people know me for my mouth and my views, but moving past, just the all whiteboard, making it, more inclusive to everyone, because that's the only way you're gonna make change, being inclusive.
Thank you. What a wonderful note to end on as well. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna, I think, throw it to Dana for any final words, but before I do, I just want to make sure that everyone knows there's an open invitation to reach out to me at any time. I'm gonna put my email and the link to my office hours to schedule time to chat with me in the chat. I'm sure it will also go out in the follow-up email. As has been referenced, we are working and engaged in Franklin County already and have been since January of last year, launching coalitions, supporting planners, supporting advocates, and we're gonna keep doing that work in the coming years. And so if you live in a community or work in a community that has not yet connected with us, I'd love to have a conversation, even if you're not really sure exactly what we might be able to do together right now, just to hear about what you're working on, what is going on in your community, challenges, opportunities, just things I should know. Oh, thank you for doing my job for me. I would love to have those conversations to make sure that I can really get as much of the full picture as possible. But with that, I will throw it back to Dana.
Yeah, I don't have much to add except to say thank you all for being here with us tonight. It's really, we do these presentations all the time and we learn something new ourselves every time as well. So we have a recording, we have the notes from the chat, we've hopefully, quick note, if you haven't learned this trick before, if you want to save the chat yourself, click on the 3 dots at the bottom, and you can save the chat, and that will allow you to take a look at all these resources that have been shared and the comments that your colleagues and your fellow community residents and advocates have been sharing. And stay tuned. Check out our website, chapa.org, to see about Affordable Housing 101 and our companion session called Confronting the History of Housing Discrimination, which goes into much more depth the start of the conversation we were having here. And like Lily said, we are here as a resource, so don't hesitate to reach out to us. And if you come across really innovative and creative ideas, if you have something that you think is replicable in other communities, please share them with us. We want to stay in contact with you about it all. And thanks to the folks at FERCOG and IH2 for working with us on this. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Bye.
Nice to see
Bye.
you.
Great to see
night.
everyone.